Good morning. Welcome to Wednesday morning's thought for today. This is most likely a shorter one than normal, but it's one which makes me smile because of the way Mark has written it more than anything else. And it's the irony that's involved in it, which I think is incredible. Jesus, this is Mark chapter 8 we're looking at, and we're really reading from this morning from verse 14 on. Jesus has just had this row with the Pharisees. He's just fed the 4,000 people before that. And he's once again back in the boat with his disciples, and they're off on another journey, going to another place where Jesus will continue to minister. Now, in these in-between times with the disciples, sometimes we don't know what happens. We know Jesus gets in the boat and they get out of the boat, and he goes from here and to there. But we don't necessarily get the insight into the things that happen in the boat. Now, Mark, obviously being part of this party, got to hear things that he then transmits to us as he writes his gospel. And I think this is very clever what he's writing, because he's trying to convey the whole issue that the disciples had with spiritual blindness that we thought about a couple of days ago back on Sunday. And the issue of spiritual blindness was very real with the disciples. They've been with Jesus twice now, where he's fed the 5,000 and then the 4,000. They've been with Jesus throughout his ministry. They've traveled with him and had conversations with him and seen him do things that are not recorded in our Bibles, and yet it must have been incredible. They've all this opportunity of believing who Jesus is and understanding who he is and being comfortable in that situation where they know who Jesus is. And yet somehow Mark exposes them as being spiritually blind. And once again, they don't come out of this looking terribly well. But Mark gives us a very human picture of the disciples. Now, we don't know whose job it was to bring the food in. It must have been their job to make sure that Jesus and the disciples had enough food. Maybe it was somebody like Judas who held the purse strings. It was also his job to maybe do the shopping, or maybe he had to sort of subcontract it to one of the other disciples and they would do the shopping for Jesus. We don't know. But whatever has happened, Mark tells us at the start of verse 14, now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. Now, that's one of the most human verses that we read in the whole of the Bible, simply because we all know what it's like. You know, when you open the door in the fridge in the morning and go, oh no, who forgot to get milk yesterday? Or who had that bowl of cereal last night? There's only a little dribble left in the container this morning. Or there's no milk whatsoever. Or there's only a heel left in the bread bin this morning. You know, this idea of being left with only enough to do one person, or not even enough to do one person, or you don't have enough to feed everyone. And the disciples had found themselves in that situation. Whosever job it was to get the bread hadn't got enough bread in. All they got was this one single loaf. Now, 12 disciples and Jesus and one loaf of bread. And we tend to think, when we think of loaf, as, you know, a pan loaf or a plain loaf or something like that, or even one of those loaves you can buy that, you know, would do maybe 2 or 3 people, and maybe not much more than that, because the loaves seem to be getting smaller nowadays. But either way, there's this thing called a loaf, a piece of bread, and there's only one of them, whether it's the one that was left from the last time, or maybe that's all they were able to get, we don't know. But they've got 12 disciples, they need to eat, there's only one loaf of bread, and the disciples are in a pickle. It's crazy to think about it, because what we're seeing is the disciples then getting in a bit of a tizzy. We're going to skip out verses 15, because this is Jesus. It's almost like Jesus is sitting in one part of the boat. The disciples are sitting in another part. They're discussing the bread. Jesus is then having a conversation, which we'll look at again tomorrow. But the disciples then picking it up in verse 16, and they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. So what's going on is they've realized they've only got this one loaf, and so they decide to have a big discussion about it. Meanwhile, Jesus is trying to speak spiritual terms into a human condition, a human state. But the disciples have got themselves so wired up about this one loaf of bread that that's all they can seem to think about or see in front of them. And the crazy thing is, they've got Jesus in the boat with them. This Jesus who took the loaves and the fish and broke them and divided them and fed people and had leftovers, this Jesus is right there in the boat with them. And they're worried about who didn't get enough bread, or how are we going to cope with one loaf. It's incredible to think that all of a sudden, it's almost like the shutters come down on what's happened in the past, and they can't see that. They're stuck in this worldly sense, an argument or a discussion that they would have had before they became part of Jesus' group of disciples. And yet here's Jesus in the boat with them. What would you do? Very obviously you'd say, Lord, whenever you finished teaching us about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, we've got a loaf here. Could you possibly make sure that there's enough just to go around with the rest of us? And Jesus, I'm certain, would have taken that bread and fed them, and they would have had enough to eat. Why? Because he had compassion on them. Why? Because he could. Why? Because he's done it before. He's proved to his disciples that he is able. But instead, this crazy conversation blows up. And into that conversation, Jesus is trying to teach them. Jesus coming off the back of a row with the Pharisees, the disciples getting all wound up about only having one loaf. It's an incredible picture. I wonder in life, do you get like that? Do you get wound up about simple things that, it's not the end of the world. We're not going to starve because there's only one loaf and 12 people have come for dinner. But I wonder sometimes, do we somehow look beyond Jesus or look past Jesus? Forget that he's part of our lives. Forget that he's promised that he'll never leave us nor forsake us. Forget that he has the power to sustain us and keep us going and blessing us. So many times I've heard of folks serving the Lord in other places where they needed something and they prayed about it, and somehow miraculously, that food was left at the door, or somebody came by and gifted them exactly what they needed. Because they asked the Father, and the Father gave them what they needed. And so often we fail to realize that in this thing we call life, Jesus is in the boat with us. And so we waste time and energy and fretting about something which all we need to do was turn to the Lord and ask him. And knowing from that he has done it before and he can do it again. It's an amazing picture that Mark paints. But I wonder ourselves, are we guilty of seeing past Jesus and getting ourselves so wound up about things whenever the answer is right there in the boat with us? I hope today that you take that opportunity to speak to the Lord and to talk to him about what it is that you need, knowing that he is able, and then watching and waiting to see how he will be there for you, and he will meet that need according to his riches in Christ. Have a good Wednesday. I'll speak to you again soon. God bless.